I want to start by talking a little bit about this talk. This is going to be a very different kind of talk than we usually give in the following sense. We usually get here, and meaning in the stage, and we talk about our work. And Robert challenged us to think about storytelling specifically. And we took him up on that challenge, and we started thinking very seriously about data visualization and storytelling in general, not necessarily only about our work and storytelling. And so what we're going to talk about today is very little about our work. I would say 95% of what you will see today is not our work. But it is something we've been noticing about storytelling when it comes to visualization. And that is the notion of genres. We're starting to see genres, and yet we don't talk about them. So we want to start a conversation tonight with you. This is not an exhaustive presentation in that we're not going to talk about all the genres in the world for visualization, but it's the beginning, what we hope will become a much longer conversation. So why genres? Well, we just spent the whole day today talking about storytelling, right? And one of the fundamental concepts in storytelling, think about books, think about movies, is this notion of genre. Writers, viewers, readers, critics will always talk about genres because it gives you a way of understanding what to expect. It sets expectations, right? So if I say this is a romance, this is science fiction, you sort of know what to expect. And that is a good thing in the sense that it means it's a shared language, right? The good part is that you can, because it's shared and your viewer or reader knows what to expect, you can take shortcuts and you know you're not going to lose people, right? The bad part of genres is that you can get stuck in them, right? They can become formulaic. And we're also seeing that happen in visualization these days. So why have this conversation now? Well, in the beginning, in the old days, whenever you did a visualization, it was such a novel thing that it was one of a kind. It was always this cool thing, right? But now visualizations are so mainstream that we're seeing a lot of repetition. And we're seeing also a lot of conventions starting to emerge, right? And again, this is what we can start thinking about as genres. So why should you care? Well, I think you should care because as people who create visualizations or infographics and care about your readers or your viewers, you're probably in a genre or two or three, right? And since you are probably in a genre, that can be a good and a bad thing. It can be a good thing if you're self-aware and you know how to play the genre well, or if you know so much about the genre that you can extend it and use it with a twist to do what Alberto was talking about, make it insightful, make it enlightening, right? If you're not aware that you're in the genre, you're sort of stuck there. You're sort of playing a formula. You're sort of using formulaic approaches. And that can lead to empty infographics and visualizations.
So yes, literature, very fertile source of analogies, we believe, for visualization. There's a lot in common. So what we'd like to do in this talk is discuss a couple of major genres from literature and find analogies, sometimes tighter, sometimes looser analogies with visualization, and think about what we can learn. Let's start with the mystery story. So the mystery story, classic example of a genre, and it spans many, many types of books and stories. We see a spectrum that can go all the way from the Hardy Boys mysteries. Here you see The Secret of the Caves, classic tales from the 50s, 60s, 70s. I grew up on these, would devour them as a kid. All the way up to the beauty of Agatha Christie, the sort of perfect mystery. And then you see other books, like The Name of the Rose, which take the mystery form and do something entirely new with it. Now, what does this have to do with visualization? What is the equivalent? Well, an easy answer would be something like a crime map or a visualization of murders. I think that's too facile. Instead, let's think about what a mystery has. It has clues. It has a revelation. It has a detective helping you through. What is like that? Well, let's take a look at some New York Times visualizations. Here we have a very simple one. This is a classic red-blue election map. You can see it's Obama versus McCain, so you can date it yourself. And this is an example of something that, it's very, very fast to read this. You look at this, you know instantly it's an election map. You could blur your eyes and squint. You could still tell it's an election map. Everything is on point. Every convention is followed. The labels are readable from space, and you know what happened right away. And that's it. You're done. You're in, you're out, it's good. Let's take a look at another visualization. Here is an election visualization from, this one is Obama versus Romney. I was staring at this all during the election. I think it's really beautifully constructed. It's like a perfect gem of an election visualization. What it's showing is a binary tree of essentially decisions based on whether Obama or Romney wins various swing states. And it sort of clicks into place as the election was happening and as they found out who is winning which state. You would kind of traverse this tree, inevitably ending up at like a check mark, revealing the big answer, the revelation. At the bottom, they're very nice. They tell you about all the scenarios. They tell you what's going on. They lead you through to the answer if you don't understand it. Let's take a look at a third. Okay, this is not an election visualization, which I think is important. This is one of my favorite visualizations ever. It's by Amanda Cox, I believe. And it's simply showing, on the top level, the past budget, or the surplus or deficit in the federal budget. Okay, that's what this thick line is over time. Okay? At the end, the line gets a little bit dimmer. That's a budget projection. But then she's done something really interesting and subtle and weird, which is if you look at this graph, it's a little bit hairy. It's got these whiskers coming off of it. Not like anything you've ever seen. You sort of have to squint. You have to kind of go through their stepper to understand that what is happening is that at each point she's overlaying the projection that was made that year and comparing it to what really happened. And if you look at it, it starts to become this amazing thing that you can see, okay, there's this consistent optimism, so many years. Interesting. You can see exactly how optimistic people were on average. At the same time, it's not as if people were always too optimistic. In fact, there's a time during the Clinton years when people greatly underestimated the degree at which the deficit was shrinking. And that gives you a lot of information. First of all, it helps you interpret the projection that you see here and gives you a healthy sense of skepticism. And also combining with all your knowledge of politics and what's going on, you can make guesses at what's happening here, why this is. To me, this is wonderful. This is an example of Alberto Caira's enlightening visualization. It really changes the way you think about any projection you see again. I think it's beautiful. So let's think about how these relate to genres again. I think there's actually a very close match between each of these visualizations and the mystery stories. So that election map, it's like a Hardy Boys mystery, for better or for worse. I think it's using all the conventions to get you directly to the point. Just as if you look at the prose in a Hardy Boys mystery, Dad, we will, Joe said eagerly. It's like, they had to add eagerly there, as if you couldn't tell it from the exclamation point in the text. Every signpost is there. And it's a fun book. It's great. It's a quick read, and this election map gets the job done. At the same point, you could point to things about this map that are a little bit sort of too usual. There are probably more red pixels on this map than blue because of the confound with area. Just as in this book, there's all sorts of stereotypes in it that maybe you don't want to perpetuate. So very interesting. What about that decision tree? So there, again, very much like Agatha Christie. So unlike the Hardy Boys mystery, you really need to read every word. There's nothing redundant in here. It's like an intricate machine. Every word of that is there either to tell you information or to distract you. And the detective himself, Hercule Poirot, is sitting there telling you what to think and giving you clues. And if you don't sort out the clues, he'll help, just like that beautiful explanation they had. And then finally, the name of the rose. So I don't expect you to be able to read all of this on the screen now, but if you could, it would be well worth your while. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. I love it. However, it is the opposite of accessible. You really have to think to read this book. It touches on so many different things. It changes the way you think. And why is it that people are willing to go through it? I think partly because it's adhering to the classical detective story tropes. That keeps you going, even when in the middle of Umberto Eco listing 32 different kinds of precious minerals. just as the careful sort of stepper in Amanda's visualization gets you through that initial difficulty in understanding to this point of enlightenment. So I think this is a very good example of sort of how genre can work in your favor, against you, and how it's a machine you can use in different ways for different effects.
So now let's go to another very crisp genre. Martin was just talking about the mystery novel. Let's talk about science fiction. That's another very crisp genre. And just by putting the covers of these books here, you know what you're about to get into, right? Because you may not know the plot, but you sort of expect that there is gonna be some technology thing in the plot. Technology is gonna be important. There's some notion of fantastic worlds, either in the future or in the past. It might be dystopic, but you know what you're getting into. My analogy to science fiction in the world of visualization is scientific visualization. So this is just a search I did on Google for scientific viz. It's as simple as that, right? And what is happening here? These visualizations are sharing a very strong vocabulary of visuals, right? They are using the rainbow color palette. We've all talked about the rainbow color palette and how you may not want to use it. But okay, let's keep that aside. They are all using the same palette. As much as they can, they are 3D. A lot of times with good cause, because they are representing 3D phenomena. Sometimes maybe not with such good cause. But either way, they form this very crisp cluster. You know what you're getting into when you find one of these visualizations. And one of the things that having a very crisp genre buys you is, again, this shared code. You don't have to explain yourselves over and over again. Think about the warp drive. Okay, so we went back to Google Books and found one of the first books that talks about warp drive. It's this book from 1950s. And the hero is saying, this ship works by warp drive. It warps space, so it can travel even faster than light. So the guy is actually explaining bit by bit what warp drive is. Fast forward to 1989, Star Trek. They are talking about warp drive, but they don't even explain. There's not even a question that you won't know what warp drive is. And why is that? That's because the genre has evolved so much that you're expected to know. There's certain things we share, okay? So it's the same thing with the visualizations that you just saw in the slide previous. Even without knowing those even without seeing the scale for the rainbow palette, I can tell you, I'm thinking all the reds are at the top of the scale and all the blues are at the bottom of the scale, right? Now think about a different kind of science fiction book. Think about New Romancer. It's, again, very much within the genre, but it's a very different kind of plot with an almost anti-hero that has different kinds of thoughts and dialogues than the guys you saw in the previous slide. So when we started thinking, is there anything like that in the visualization world that is using scientific data in a different way? One of the examples we came up with is this range of visualizations here that deal with flow. Okay, so at the bottom left, you have the beautiful Earth wind map that just came out last year by Cameron Beccario. And there Cameron is using very much all the conventions of the scientific visualization world. It is a 3D globe. You can spin the globe. He uses the rainbow palette. And it's a very beautiful visualization. The piece at the top by NASA sort of stays a little bit away from those hardcore scientific visualization elements, in that they use a very different palette. They're not using rainbow palette. They are using a 3D globe, but the coloring is a lot more naturalistic than you might expect. And then there's people like Martin and I who decided very purposefully to not use the conventions in scientific visualization, even though we were visualizing hardcore scientific data, right? So very purposefully, we said, we don't want any color. That's not what we want. We are not going to draw every boundary of every state so that you know exactly where the wind is starting, where it's going, where it's turning. We want this to look like flow. All we care about here is the flow. We very purposefully said we want a poetic image of wind. We don't want anything to stand in the way between you and the wind. That's what we want. It was a choice, right? But it gives you this set of visualizations, hopefully gives you a sense of the range in which you can play, even if your data set is highly, highly scientific. You still have choices, and you're still communicating every single choice you make visually.
All right, so let's go from science to pop science. And by pop science, I think you know what I mean. Books like this, Blink, Bonk, Stuck, and Fuck, and all their cousins. One word, colon, long subtitle that explains it. What is the pop data equivalent? Again, I think some of you may have already guessed what that is. It's the infographic. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of infographics, and by infographic, I mean one big number and a lot of text, a lot of little icons. I don't think that's fair. I think these things actually have a place and a purpose. And in fact, the one that you see here, I actually think is quite good. It gets its point across. It has one big number. It's talking about homeless students in the New York City school system. That number is a really big number, I think bigger than many people would guess. It explains it. It has little icons. I think the icons do a perfectly good job of getting across the idea that there are many, many more of these students than you would expect. It has a simple quantitative point in a narrowly defined area, and it makes it. I think it works. Let's look at some others. Here's an example of where those numbers can be a trap. Here is an infographic from Visually that boils down the question of, is your bachelor's degree worth it? Which I think is quite an existential question to be settled by a bunch of 5-digit numbers. And once you have something that's complicated, you see that actually the genre really starts to break down. Like the convention of like a big number and text means that over at the right, where there are all these sections, you can't really tell what the sections are about. You can't really get a sense of the structure of the argument at all. Here, the conventions are working against you. What else can happen? Well, there's also this. So here's an infographic from Al Jazeera. And putting aside whatever the intent of this visualization was, I think it's fair to say that boiling down 20 years in the Middle East to 4 numbers is probably a little too simple. You know, Malcolm Gladwell is not going to be right. You know, if you think about what works, it's picking out a narrowly defined area. Malcolm Gladwell picked out things like the tipping point. You know, you will not see a Gladwell book called something like Bummer, 20 Years of the Middle East. You know, it's you have to kind of scope yourself down. The other danger with this, and I think this is a danger for pop science authors as well, is that certain tropes can start to feel a little bit tired. You know, these books with one big word on their cover, I think they're going to feel a little bit dated in a year, and 10 years, say. You may not care about it, but you might. We're already seeing plenty of people making fun of infographics for that very reason. Now, does that mean you should give up on infographics? No. As we mentioned, some can be quite good. And there's another approach that I think is especially good once a genre becomes very well known, which is approach it with a wink. And so we can see, for example, in the Feltron annual report, he does a wonderful job of applying sort of this corporate annual report style to his own life, sort of co-opting it in a new way. And in fact, also, if you look at this, he's doing a very good job of it as well. The data density of this infographic is quite impressive. He's using words instead of numbers as headlines often. So it's very well done. So I don't think you should ever give up on necessarily any genre in particular. However.
Except for the next one. Well, so Martin just talked about a very dangerous genre here, I'll say. You have to know what you're doing when you're doing infographics. I think the next thing is sort of beyond redemption. Skin deep copies. We thought really hard about what we would call this one. So let's go back to the world of literature. And here's what we have for you. 50 Shades of Grey. I'm not saying whether this is good or bad. I'm not going to get into that. But I'm just going to say 50 Shades of Grey, extremely popular, right? On top of tons of best-selling lists. Okay, let's take that as a given. Now, you're an author. You look at 50 Shades of Grey and you think what? Ooh, that formula works. I'm going to do just like you. And I'm going to do a knockoff of 50 Shades of Grey. And check it out. Even my cover is going to be exactly like your 50 Shades of Grey cover. So that is almost a caricature. And I feel like we have that in visualization because I'm about to present you with the periodic table of visualization methods, right? So, yeah. Isn't it a cosmic coincidence that we have just as many visualization methods as there are elements in the universe? It's amazing that it fits so well. So, and of course you have clusters and you have, anyway, it doesn't stop here. Then we get alcohol. There's also a periodic table of alcohol drinks. And there are many more. I mean, seriously, we could give an entire talk just about periodic tables of whatever you can think of under the sun. With this one, I even took I was like, no, maybe they are doing something smart here. Maybe the numbers mean the amount of alcohol. And then I looked at the key and it said, no, the key is the number of the beverage, the type of beverage. I'm like, okay, of course. So anyway, so I'm not going to spend the rest of the talk talking about periodic tables, but I'm going to talk about my second favorite, which is subway maps. Right, so subway maps. This one happens to be of Doctor Who. Of course you need a Doctor Who subway map. And of course you need a subway map of the internet. This is back in 2007 Web Trends map. So this has to stop. I just don't know how to say otherwise. Like, this has to stop. And so to me, this is a direct parallel to the kind of knockoffs and the kind of, again, mindless use of a formula. You find a formula, and then you shove data into that formula without really thinking about, the periodic table is wonderful. I love the periodic table. There's a very specific reason about why it looks the way it looks and how it works and why it's such a genius thing. So let's respect that. Let's respect the visualization. Let's respect form follows function and, basic symbols like that, basic principles like that. Now, this is not to say, I really don't want to stand here and say, oh, you should never use a visual metaphor. Visual metaphors are bad. If you want to use a visual metaphor that everybody is very familiar with, go for it. Do something interesting and insightful with it. So for instance, to me, this is an example of someone who has taken a visual metaphor and used it in an interesting way. So this is XKCD's online communities too, right? So back in 2010, he actually drew a map of sociable places in the web. This is a make-believe map, but the fact that some of these things are bigger than others, some of these things are closer to others, they have borders, some of these things are continents, other are islands. He actually thought about this. He actually built this map from scratch. He didn't just stake a map of the world, for instance, and put Facebook in North America and Twitter or Skype in other parts of the world. He actually thought about this. So again, I think if you're going to co-opt a visual metaphor, do it in a smart way.
Okay, so there's one genre that we have not talked about that is huge in literature, and that is the love story. And by love story, I mean the full gamut of things, from Jane Eyre to the Virgin Secretary's Impossible Boss. What is the equivalent in visualization? So, I'm not going to stand here and say there's a whole genre of visualization about, showing the relationships between two people as they fall in love. However, instead, let's think, what is sort of a foundational genre of visualization, type of visualization that has always been with us almost as long as we've been drawing pictures and is one of the sort of mainstays? And I think the answer is maps. So let's look at some maps and think about how they play to genre. Because it turns out, I believe there's some interesting lessons here. Here is what I think is a classic information map. This is from Wikimedia. It's showing population density in the United States. I think it does quite a good job of it. Very interesting. You could kind of look at it for a long time if you're interested in density. Let's look at a slightly more sophisticated map. This is a racial dot map from the University of Virginia. It's one in a fairly long line of these maps, but it's quite nice. The idea behind this map is that there's one dot for each person surveyed in the 2010 US Census. And the dots are placed within census tracts where the people lived. And they're colored by race with this slight sort of Stroop effect key where like green means black and blue means white. And you look at it, and it suddenly becomes much, much more interesting, I think, than just a pure density map. This is Baltimore you see there. This is Annapolis. If you look at where we are right now, it's this almost entirely white thing. It's like they could see this room. It becomes very interesting. Nervous laughter, because it's a good visualization that is starting to have some commentary. So I think this is good. This is a map going beyond just sort of stating facts and starting to make you question. Let's look at some other maps that you see frequently. We heard from Alberto Cairo about taxi cab maps. Yes, taxi maps. They're all over.
It almost felt like we had planted you there, Alberto.
Yes.
So thanks.
Now, I like these maps. When I first saw this taxi map from Stamen, I was like, wow, that is beautiful. It's like San Francisco is a living thing. I love how these trails work. This New York City map is interesting. This BBC map, it's glowing. It's like lava or something, or blood flowing through the veins of the city. It's really beautiful. I sort of watched the video and I was like, this is great. But all of these remind me of something else. And they remind me of a picture I took in a used bookstore in Fort Myers. This is a picture of some romance novels, Texas Brides, Alberta Brides, Bayou Brides, Renaissance Brides. What this series has is a formula, and it takes that formula and applies it to different places, and it gets something out of it that people like to read. There is nothing wrong with that. That, though, is sort of what's happening at this point with taxi maps. And I think ultimately it's a little bit of a missed opportunity in a way that I'll talk more about in a moment. What else do we have? Here's another kind of classic map that you see. This is a map someone made of the top 1% of real estate deals in New York, ostensibly related to Hurricane Sandy. He was asking, do a lot of the wealthy live near the waterfront? No, they live in the Upper East Side. Surprise. In fact, a huge number of maps end up showing wealth and class in some form, and almost become this voyeuristic home of the stars experience. I think even when you look at something that I think is a good thing to have, like a campaign contribution map, in the end, it often becomes something where you're just marveling at the wealth of certain zip codes. Again, it's a tricky line because this is a critical issue for us as a society to understand wealth, class, how it's distributed. But there's something else going on as well that I think you can see very clearly when you look at romance novels. Here's another picture from that Fort Myers store of another shelf where we see the naughty knights in the millionaire's mansion, mistress to the merciless millionaire, hotshot tycoon, indecent proposal, the Desert King's housekeeper bride, and so forth. I think the fact of the matter is that sometimes these maps become interesting social commentary. Sometimes they tell you what you want to know or surprise you. Other times they become yet another way of just looking at the Upper East Side of Manhattan and how rich it is. And I think it's very important when you make a map to think, what are you doing? Are you saying something interesting and new? Or is it possible that just a little bit of the appeal is the same as the Virgin Secretary's impossible boss? So let's go through this. We have Jane Eyre, classic love story, classic map. Pride and Prejudice, this has a little bit of a sting to it. It's got some commentary there. Texas Brides, yes, like these taxi maps. And again, here's what I want to say. This is a massive missed opportunity. If you think about Name of the Rose, that was something that could get a really hard to understand, difficult subject across because it used a really appealing form. Someone needs to use this taxi map genre, subgenre, to get across something that's genuinely challenging. And finally, there are maps that end up showing wealth, and you have to think about that. Are you showing something interesting, or are you appealing in some way to prurience?
So because Martin talked so much about voyeurism, the next genre is something that I think works really well in visualization because it appeals to our sense of voyeurism. And that is the notion of collections. And it is something that we're seeing more and more in literature, in the print media too. So you have books these days about any kind of collection under the sun, right? So you have Humans of New York, which is a collection of portraits. John Maida's Maeda in Media, which is a collection of new media works. And then something like Paris in Color, which again is a collection of pictures. And you have tons of different kinds of collections. That is a very easy thing to translate to visualization because we also love to do visualizations that are about collections, right? And actually, that works really well. So this, for instance, is Bloomberg's Billionaires. Again, imagine if Bloomberg had done the set of the top wealthiest people in the planet if instead of faces, they had put little circles there. How interesting would have that been, right? We love to look at those faces. Looking at those faces actually lets me see right away, you know, are most of these people white? What's going on here? Are they mostly men, females, old, young? It gives me information. So in doing collections, it's sort of like you want to think about it as a collection of butterflies. They are little insects that you want to play with, look at. The other thing about this dashboard is that on top of it being whimsical, it's also a much more complicated data set than that. It breaks down by demographics, right? So you have gender, age. It breaks down by industries, by citizenship even. So you can play with it. It's very exploratory. This is not a new genre. This is something that has existed for a while. So this is one of my favorite sort of comparison charts. It's comparing at the top the length of rivers, the main rivers in the world. And at the bottom, it's comparing the height of the highest mountains in the world. And this is a really cool way of drawing connections between things you may not have thought of before. I come from Brazil, and I always think about the Amazon as like the greatest river on earth. And then I see that the Nile is longer. Yes, I should have known that. The Amazon has more water, though. It's true. You can check. But it gives you a sense of a landscape, right? And that is what you want when you put a collection together. Then there are pieces like this one, which is called The Strands of American History from the New York Times. And it's actually all the hairstyles of first ladies in the US. And the cool thing to me about this one is that they distilled the information to its minimum. So you're not seeing faces here. You're just seeing hair. But at the bottom, if you look at that bottom row, if you all can see it, you know exactly who they're talking about, even without the faces, right? Which is really amazing. And it explained to me how much hairstyles matter in the White House. And so because Alberto was talking about that piece today that he redesigned to show comparison, I think it was Countries with Medals. Yes, it inspired us to put one more example of collections here. So it's something we actually did, Martin and I. We were interested in understanding how much we talk about the body, about body parts in music. So this is a project, it's an art project we did a long time ago. And so we actually got thousands, I think 10,000 songs, and actually counted the number of times body parts show up in these different songs. And then we separated by genre. So for instance, let's look at folk. This is folk music. And this is just a bubble chart. The area tells you how much that body part shows up. So you can see that folk is very gentle, right? It's all about the eyes and the face and the hands, some about the mouth, and so forth. Okay, the blues, also very gentle genre. It has fewer body parts, but again, faces and hands and arms, a lot of knees. People are down on their knees a lot in blues. And eyes, right? And then you get into places like heavy metal, which happen to have a whole lot more of body parts, But again, they focus on the eyes and the hands and the face, okay? So we wanted people to be we wanted it to be very easy for people to compare across all of these genres. So even though we did these medallions for each one of the genres, we really wanted it to be very easy to look at all genres together. So we also did this, which is very simple. And I'll let you look at it more closely. So these are all the genres we found. And you can see that you can very quickly compare. And I'll say what is the usual through all the genres is that eyes and hands tend to be at the top, except for hip-hop, of course. Hip-hop not only has a difference, it is also the genre with, by far, the longest parts of the body list that we found. So much so that we had to cut, because otherwise everything would be too short, too small to show here. But again, using a very, very simple technique helped us make the comparison, because this is what we cared about, helped us make the comparison that much more quick to understand. And so, again, I feel like collections are a very benign genre. It's very easy. It lends itself very nicely to visualization because we love looking at collections of things, especially if the little individual things are intricate and interesting in their own sense. One last thought on this is I thought it was really nice to see sort of what I consider an expansion of the collection genre from the New York Times when they were talking about fashion, where not only do you get the aggregate view of different collections, you can also interact with this view and actually see more detail for each one of the individual pieces in these collections.
Okay, so one last genre, that is fantasy. So fantasy, what is the equivalent of visualization? Is it when you have faked data that you've made up? Hopefully that never happens. Instead, I would suggest an interesting thing about fantasy is that, to me, it's a genre teetering on the brink of disaster. There is really good fantasy and really awful fantasy. I think partly because some of the tropes of fantasy are so cool. It's like orcs and elves and elvish script and one ring to rule them all and potions class. Like you could, many a beginning author in their teen years has tried to write a fantasy story and felt really happy at the end, only to realize they forgot like a plot because they were so busy describing the blessed sword. And it's really an example of a genre where the form can kind of take over if you're not careful. What is an equivalent in visualization? I would suggest that network diagrams fill that role. Nothing wrong with network diagrams per se, but be careful. Here are some, you can see some typical problems on the left are sort of classic hairballs where it's very, very hard to get anything out of these because there's so much going on. The network on the right, a little more interesting. I looked at this at first and I was like, wow, that's actually cool. I can see stuff. There's real things going on. There's like this weird disconnected group. There are these clicks. There are these big yellow dots. What does it mean? Well, I'll tell you. It turns out this is actually a test graph created with randomized data in Gephi. So you can see patterns where none exist. It's a lot like if you made a game of just making up characters by rolling dice and putting them in a fantasy context. Fun, but ultimately perhaps empty. This is not to say that this is a genre to be avoided, though. You just have to know how to use it. Here's an interesting example where they got a little more power out of the genre. So Adamic and Glantz in 2005 did a now classic study where they looked at blogs, political blogs, colored them red and blue, connected them if they linked to each other. And this is like a perfect mashup of an election map and a network diagram. And this mashup has now become its own like cottage industry. If you look for this type of thing on Google, you'll just find a gazillion examples. It's gone hugely viral. You can think if that reminds you of any mashups you know, but I think it shows the power of combining other genres with the network diagram. Here's a very whimsical example that I like a lot because it's so clear. This is a person decided to look at phrases of the form like, blue is the new black. or yellow is the new red. Any X is the new Y. And they realized they could make a network diagram out of this. And it's easy to understand. You know, the type is small, you may not be able to read it, but you can spend a long time looking at this. Like, the numbers are fascinating. 30 is the new 40, yet 50 is the new 30. Well, some say 30 is the new 30. So it's quite fascinating, and I think, you know, actually it works. What about this? This is a really nice map from the Washington Post. This is showing a vast political network backed by the Koch brothers. And I think this is using the network in every perfect way. Like, first of all, it's pretty easy to understand. It's relatively simplified. They have that detective at the bottom leading you through, little mystery story aspect there. They've colored things nicely. There is a lot of complexity. There are a lot of lines crossing. It is kind of a tangled web. But it's using that genre well. Like, they want you to think of this as a tangled web. That's part of their point. So they're making use of the traditions. So this is, I think, another good example of the variety. I would say Twilight is actually the model for this red-blue map of the mashup that spawned a million imitators. And it's, you know, overall, I think it's a good example of all the different ways that genre conventions can be played with and used. So that's really our message that we'd like to leave you with. You cannot not communicate. That's a famous quote that became the title of a book by a typographer. And I think the same is true of genre. You cannot not be in a genre. You are working against conventions or with conventions, you know, whether you mean to or not. And so the message ultimately is you should be in control of your genre. Always think about it, or else your genre will control you. So we'll end there. We've tried to leave time for questions because we view this as the beginning of a conversation. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. How long have we got for questions, Ellie?
We have 15 minutes.
10 or 15 minutes, wow. Okay, hands up. I'll focus on that side of the room as well. Or do you guys not want to answer questions? Ask questions. No.
I'm not apologizing for the 50 Shades of Grey books ripoffs at all, of course. But I was struck by the fact that 2 of those books that you put up there claimed to have been international bestsellers.
Yes.
Yes. So, I mean, the thing I said on Twitter, which caused a couple people to question me too, was like, those books were actually quite successful by book terms. Anyone would say that was a successful ripoff. And yet I think you were saying those were not successful ripoffs of the periodic table, et cetera, obviously, because that's your point, right?
So I think the metaphor, the analogy goes even further. I do think that they were successful in terms of going viral. Everybody seems to love periodic tables of everything. And I don't know if it's just me, but I'm just sitting there thinking, really? Really? Is that what we want to? So that is the thing. And I feel like it's the same thing with the social networks that Martin was saying. A lot of these things go viral. And yet it's like, what is the message here? What insight are we trying to gather from these things?
Okay, anyone else? Oh, over there.
I loved the distillation of the different levels of visualizations compared to the different levels of in each genre. And I'm wondering, do you have thoughts on how to use those distinctions when you're thinking about the different audiences you want to reach? So are there particular aspects of the genre that tie more to particular audience segments, or are all of those more or less universal?
I think that's a great question, because thinking about the mystery stories, for example, so the Hardy Boys mysteries, which I think you can really spend a lot of time making fun of the writing, but at the same time, as someone who was a huge fan for several years of his life, I remember that writing worked for me, you know, at the age of 7 or 8. And so I think, you know, some of these maps, some of these things, if you imagine that your user is in an incredible hurry, they just need to know something quickly, use conventions wherever you can. Picture, like, are they going to spend time? Do they want to get a certain feel? By all means. I don't think we would want, at least for me, I wouldn't want every book I read to be some incredibly deep tome. Like, I like to have a balance. And I think that's true of most people. So thinking about your audience, try to think carefully about what they're ready for and also what they know. I think a red-blue election map, if you went back to, 1978 and showed it to people, might actually be kind of incomprehensible. The whole set of conventions, that wasn't there yet, I think. Think about, has your audience seen this kind of thing before? And have they seen it too much? Have they seen it not enough? That's one axis. And then the other axis is, how much time do they have? How much do you want to exploit the shortcuts of a convention to move quickly versus how much do you want to play against them to surprise and delight?
Thank you. Any more over here? I can see one over there. I won't go over there. Oh, you do.
It's just the periodic table ripoffs really bother me a lot too. And I think part of that, most people here will understand, is that it completely ignores the underlying data structure underneath the table. It's not even plugging into a network diagram where you have numbers. The periodic table is a beautiful thing. And I think it just really is painful to see it abused so poorly.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I guess it would be in poor taste to say that I think the one exception that I've seen is the periodic table of English curse words, which is really clever and actually has a logic that sort of follows.
Can you send that to us?
I think that when you get up into the isotopes, like the plutonium ones, they're really dirty. But they've got different rows for poop, pee pee, caca, and it's really.
I think all's fair in love and
stuff.
humor. When you're making a joke, you can get away with a lot.
What about the intentionality of visualizations as being a genre? I've had this notion for a while that certain visualizations are more driven by the data, like that the reason we do taxi cab visualizations, or that we did them in 2005, was because there was such novelty to it, that this was stuff that was unknowable before. Nobody knew where all the taxi cabs were, and then we knew where they were. And then it wasn't long after that they were like, okay, yeah, I know where they are. I know every cab in San Francisco wants to go to the airport. Okay, I get it. But there was a time when that was pretty novel and pretty important. And so it's really just about the fact that we have this data, we never had it before. And then there's visualizations that seem to be really driven by the format, where the data itself is often stuff that you've seen a million times before, but it's in a new way. And just as an example, like when they take all the countries of the world and smush them into Africa, that kind of thing. It's like turning things upside down I think that when we get into some of these firefights is when we don't agree on, or we haven't established the baseline of what did the person who made the visualization, what were they trying to do? Was all roads, all streets, was that an art visualization? Was just like, hey, I took all of OpenStreetMaps and I plotted it, and it shows you something. Versus something with an intentionality. Because I think another genre is the ones where you're trying to persuade people to come around to a point of view, whether it's like gun deaths or what have you. So anyway, that's something that I think would be worth exploring.
Yeah, I agree with you. To your point about the maps and the whole notion of novelty versus we've already seen that. I feel like part of the context for us to think about these things as genres was, we're here talking about storytelling. So one of the things we try to do very seriously in our work is to ask, what story are we telling people? Or what are the things people are going to get out of this visualization? Because I think it's very easy to do the first thing you can, right? We've done this many times, and believe me, we have an entire talk talking about how to get to the wind map, like how many things we tried and how awful they were, and what it took us to get to the final solution. But I think that is one thing that I think we need to be very honest as creators of these visuals, is always ask yourself, if you're happy with the story you're telling, and you're telling the story of cabs that always go downtown, and that is the story you want to tell, that's cool, if that's all you want. But if you want to tell a different story, then you need to work at it. Then you need to go beyond that. And I feel like that is the kind of thing we're interested in, is really being honest and critical about what is it that your viewer or your reader is going to get out of the thing you just created.
I think your question also touches on another interesting issue, which is that genres change over time, and the meaning of what you do depends on when you do it. So, if a Renaissance artist painted a painting that happened to have a tiled floor in the middle of a forest, it was actually a brilliant way to sort of introduce the technology of perspective into the painting and give viewers cues of what's going on. If I did that today, it would be just weird, or maybe it would be an allusion to Renaissance painting. I think with the CAB data, that's a great example. When that was done, I think that had it still does, and I think we need to appreciate it on its own terms, that it was this beautiful view of live data, the city as a living thing. Today, if someone else does it, it means something completely different than when Stamen did it for the first time. And I think all of these genres themselves will have different meanings in 10 years. So it's something that's one of the tricky things. We have to stay on top of it.
So I'm sort of interested in thinking about the effect of tools and platforms here on the kinds of visualizations that we create. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, what extent you think the tools that we create may be influencing these genres, or whether you think, we should be building tools and platforms that are genre aware.
I think that's a very subtle question. I don't know the answer. I'll give you an example of something where we see a tool having made a difference. There was a time, let's say, 2005, when motion was actually kind of hard to do well. Animated transitions had this rich, expensive feeling. Any visualization that had them felt luxurious and special. D3 has made animated transitions so simple now that it's that's the price of admission. If your visualization is jerking around, that's just annoying. Don't do that. And as a result, it's no longer some special thing. It's like the top of the Washington Monument is, I just think, made of aluminum or something, because that was incredibly expensive back when it was built. Today, it's just aluminum. And I think platforms and tools can take this effect of something being high-tech or expensive and turn it into just the price of admission, something standard. So that would be one example. I think there are probably other ways that it could be affected as well.
As an unemployable English major who became a designer, I want to go with your genre cases and challenge you. So, in good nature, love stories maps.
Yeah, right.
My reaction. My reaction to it, thinking it out, is I had a very deep relationship with the USGS sector map of the place that I went to live after I left college, because when I had that on the wall, that map actually had every building around the farm that I lived in. So I felt like this was a capture of the data that I lived in, and that didn't, fast forward number of decades, now that's normal. And not only that, but I can watch myself move around in it, right? and there's a long history of how maps have always been an expression of people's understanding of the world that they live in. So maybe they're novels, maybe there's some other way of talking about them also as an entry to collections, as in terms of atlases, as a place where you start, and then now that you've found this, you see the information about that and the information about that. Because I think that's largely how they've evolved as they become more digital.
Yeah.
I would buy that.
Yeah, I think it's point well taken. And and our pairing of maps to romance is something that we went back and forth on. And we wanted to talk about romance, and we wanted to talk about maps, and we're like, they're central, let's do it. But you called this on it, so yeah.
Last question. My question is about mobile as a consumption platform, and a lot of the examples and a lot of the awesome stuff that's being built right now seems to be more designed for a desktop experience and not a mobile experience. And I wondered if you guys could talk a little bit about where you see visualizations taking shape and what they look like, or what they ultimately what will be the taxi map of the mobile visualization, if you will, a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now?
Wow, it's like 3 different questions in one. If I could tell you what would be one good visualization on mobile, I'd be happy. I think, I think we haven't yet cracked the nut on mobile, visualization on mobile. I think it's great that we can get, now we're at a point where a lot of the technology is available enough that we can get certain things on tablets and phones. I don't know that anyone has done a mobile first visualization or has thought about that as being the first place where you interact with a visualization necessarily. And I'm very interested in that question too. One of the things I hope for is that whatever happens in that area of mobile-first visualization takes into account the fact that you exist in the world and that you're carrying this thing in the world with you. So that is my hope. But I wish I had more of a forecast for you. I don't. I only have a challenge.
Thank you very much.
Fernanda and Mark.
Thank you.